Imagine opening your pantry and finding emptiness where food used to be. That possibility is not science fiction, but a real and urgent economic risk. Over the last 2 years, fertilizer prices surged and then tripled, changing the calculations for farmers around the world. If farmers cannot afford fertilizer, crop yields fall and food security collapses for millions of people. Fertilizer is the invisible engine behind modern agriculture and industrial crop yields. Without sufficient nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, plants simply cannot produce the abundance humans expect. The world has grown used to cheap fertilizer that sustains high yields and reliable harvests year after year. That reliance becomes a vulnerability the moment energy, trade, or geopolitics change the price and availability of key inputs. The most important connection to understand is that industrial fertilizer is an energy product as much as a chemical. Producing synthetic nitrogen fertilizer requires hydrogen, and most of that hydrogen comes from natural gas through the Haber-Bosch process. Bosch consumes large volumes of natural gas, both as feedstock and as a source of heat and pressure for chemical reactions. When natural gas becomes expensive, so does the fertilizer that depends on it, and the price sensitivity of that relationship is dramatic. Global fertilizer supply is concentrated, and a few large producers dominate the market's flows. Countries like Russia and Belarus, along with major chemical companies worldwide, control a substantial share of exported fertilizers and key intermediate inputs. Concentration creates leverage, and when supply chains are disrupted, the whole system feels the shock. That leverage becomes particularly potent when coinciding with soaring energy costs and trade disruptions. Then the Russia-Ukraine war introduced a geopolitical wedge into this fragile system and made those flows unreliable. Sanctions, export restrictions, and logistics problems constricted the supply of fertilizer and raw materials almost overnight. Ports were closed. Shipping costs spiked, and companies hesitated to enter risky markets, creating a ripple effect across the global market. For importing countries and marginal farmers, the signals were immediate and deeply troubling. Between 2021 and 2022, fertilizer prices roughly tripled in many markets, a staggering move that reverberated across agriculture. This was not a subtle adjustment, it was a market shock of a magnitude most farmers had not experienced in living memory. High prices forced rapid recalculation for planting decisions. Budgets and loan repayments across farms of all sizes, the speed and scale of that spike foreshadowed deeper strain on the coming harvests. Natural gas itself surged in price because of multiple overlapping crises in energy markets. Supply constraints increased demand, and geopolitical uncertainty pushed gas prices into unprecedented territory for many countries. Because natural gas is both an energy commodity and a raw material for fertilizer, its price acts like a throttle on agricultural productivity. When energy costs double or triple, fertilizer manufacturers either cut production or pass those costs directly on to farmers. Some governments responded with export bans or taxes to keep domestic supplies affordable, and those choices further strained global markets. Trade restrictions can protect local consumers in the short term while starving import-dependent countries of critical inputs. Every barrier, from licensing delays to bank penalties for dealing with sanctioned entities, creates friction that magnifies shortages. The result is cascading and often invisible until a harvest fails. At the farm level, the math is brutal and unforgiving for individual growers deciding what to buy. Fertilizer is one of the highest variable costs on a farm budget, and when that cost triples, margins quickly evaporate. Some farmers chose to cut fertilizer application rates to save money, a short-term survival move with long-term consequences. Reduced application often translates into smaller plants, lower grain counts, and less overall yield per hectare. Smallholder farmers in poorer countries face an even starker choice between feeding their families and buying fertilizer they cannot afford. Many of these farms were operating at low margins before the price shock, making them uniquely vulnerable. In nations that rely on imported fertilizer, scarcity means planting less or foregoing fertilizer entirely, which reduces national production capacity. The downstream effect can be widespread food insecurity and increased dependency on food aid. When many farms simultaneously reduce fertilizer use, aggregate crop yields begin to fall and markets quickly show the strain. Yield declines are not evenly distributed and often strike hardest where soils are already degraded. Lower yields then amplify price increases for food commodities, creating a feedback loop that hits consumers hardest in low-income regions. What starts as an input shock becomes a full-blown food supply problem when it propagates through the agricultural system. Global food prices were already on the rise, but fertilizer-driven yield declines accelerate that inflation dramatically and painfully. In many countries, food prices rose more than 50% compared to pre-crisis baselines, destabilizing budgets and political stability. For consumers, Higher food prices mean less nutritious diets and more food insecurity, especially for vulnerable populations. For governments, it means pressure to subsidize basics or risk civil unrest when staples become unaffordable. Supply chains do not exist in isolation. They are systems of interdependent parts that amplify shocks through feedback and delay. The fertilizer crisis interacts with transport bottlenecks, labor shortages, and financial stress on farms to produce complex outcomes. Those interactions make forecasting difficult, and that uncertainty itself is damaging because it prevents rational long-term planning. Farmers and policymakers must act under pressure, often defaulting to conservative choices that reduce output further. The link between energy and food is not theoretical. It is concrete and measurable and dangerous when ignored. An energy crisis that raises costs for fertilizers directly translates into lower agricultural productivity in the short term. Policy debates about energy independence and geopolitics therefore have immediate implications for what ends up on dinner tables. Recognizing this connection is the first step to preventing deeper humanitarian consequences. Some countries are already experiencing crises linked to fertilizer scarcity and rising food costs, and the examples offer warnings and lessons. Reports from regions in East Africa and South Asia highlight how quickly local markets can deteriorate under stress. Where imports become unaffordable, food availability and nutritional quality decline, and emergency aid becomes the default response. Those emergency responses are costly, slow, and often insufficient to prevent loss of life. Governments have several blunt tools to blunt the worst effects, including price supports, subsidies, and strategic reserves. But each option carries trade-offs. Subsidies can be expensive and distort markets, while reserves require prior investment and logistical capability. Some countries are rethinking agricultural policy and considering localized production of fertilizer or alternative nutrient sources. These strategies take time, however, and do not solve immediate shortages gripping planting seasons. Markets signal scarcity and encourage innovation, and there are several technical responses that can reduce fertilizer dependence over time. Precision agriculture, improved fertilizer formulations, and better soil management can increase nutrient efficiency while lowering total input demand. Organic and regenerative techniques also offer resilience, but scaling these approaches requires training, capital, and time. In the short term, those innovations cannot fully replace the high-yield chemistry upon which global food systems currently depend. Private companies are also responding with investments in new plants, alternative feedstocks, and recycled nutrient technologies, signaling that markets can adapt. Building capacity takes capital and time, and investors look for stable policy frameworks to justify large-scale projects. The pace of transition will determine how quickly vulnerabilities are reduced, and which countries manage to insulate themselves from future shocks. Without coordinated international action, adaptation will be patchy and unequal. In the absence of rapid corrective measures, the worst-case scenarios are grim and require sober attention from global leaders. Multiple seasons of reduced yields could deplete grain reserves and push more nations into import dependence, just when global supply tightens further. Humanitarian crises could expand, and political instability could rise in regions where food affordability collapses. Understanding and planning for these scenarios is not alarmism, but prudent risk management. There are also plausible positive scenarios that deserve attention because policy can change outcomes rapidly with the right incentives. Coordinated subsidies for vulnerable farmers, targeted trade agreements, and investment in alternative fertilizer sources can blunt the immediate pain. International cooperation on energy and agricultural policy, combined with emergency food aid where necessary, can prevent the most tragic outcomes. The window to act effectively is narrow and closing with each planting season. Long-term resilience demands rethinking how we produce fertilizers and how agriculture uses them, moving from wasteful abundance to efficient stewardship. This implies research into green hydrogen, ammonia synthesis without fossil fuels, and circular nutrient economies. Those technological shifts are possible, but require public and private commitments at scale. The transition could create a more robust system, but will not be instantaneous. The fertilizer crisis is not merely an agricultural problem, it is a mirror reflecting deeper vulnerabilities in our energy, trade, and political systems. When one critical input becomes expensive or scarce, the whole structure that depends on it destabilizes quickly. Recognizing those interdependencies changes how we think about food security, energy policy, and international cooperation. It forces a broader conversation about resilience rather than short-term fixes. The most important decision today is whether to treat this as a temporary crunch or a structural moment demanding strategic investment. If leaders choose to act decisively, painful shocks can be softened and pathways to sustainable fertilizer production accelerated. If leaders delay, the human cost will fall on the poorest and most vulnerable, and recovery will be slower and more expensive. The choices are moral as well as economic. There is a philosophical lesson hidden inside this crisis about the illusion of abundance and the fragility of modern systems. We grew accustomed to cheap calories and abundant harvests, without appreciating the complex energy and geopolitical choreography behind them. The fertilizer crisis reminds us that abundance is a choice that must be maintained through investment foresight and cooperation. If we accept that responsibility, we can avoid catastrophe. If we ignore it, the consequences will be measured in human lives. If this gave you a new perspective on what makes our food secure and what endangers it, think about what choices you want leaders to make next. Share this video with someone who cares about the future of food and the fairness of our global systems. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and follow for more deep dives that connect technology, policy, and human stories. Our food is a shared responsibility, and understanding the crisis is the first step toward solving it.